"Do not sign that document, sir. Your translator is not telling you the truth." The words were barely louder than a whisper, yet they silenced a conference room where $1 billion was only seconds away from changing hands. Every executive around the polished walnut table turned toward the young waitress standing quietly beside the coffee service cart. Claire Harper did not raise her voice. She did not point a finger. She simply held the silver coffee pot in one hand and met the billionaire's eyes with calm certainty, as though the next decision would matter far more than anyone else in the room realized. Ethan Brooks slowly lifted the fountain pen that had hovered above the final page of the agreement. For the first time that morning, he hesitated. The skyline of Manhattan stretched beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of the luxury hotel conference suite, bathed in bright autumn sunlight. Inside, everything reflected success. Crystal water glasses stood perfectly aligned. Fresh white orchids decorated the center of the table. Expensive tailored suits filled every chair. Attorneys quietly reviewed documents one last time, while financial advisors checked figures displayed across sleek digital screens. Months of negotiations had brought everyone to this exact moment. One signature would launch a partnership expected to reshape international logistics across 3 continents. Ethan Brooks had completed dozens of deals larger than this during his career. Confidence had become second nature. He trusted preparation. He trusted experienced advisors. Most of all, he trusted the professional interpreter seated beside the foreign delegation, a man with years of impressive credentials and flawless recommendations. There was absolutely no reason to question anything, which was exactly why Claire's quiet warning landed with such unexpected force. The interpreter looked up immediately, surprise flashing across his face before disappearing behind a practiced professional smile. Several executives exchanged confused glances. One attorney frowned, clearly irritated that a waitress had interrupted a confidential meeting. Another executive leaned back in his chair, convinced there had been some misunderstanding. Claire remained exactly where she stood. Her white button-up shirt was neatly pressed beneath a simple black waitress apron. Her silver name tag reflected the morning light. Nothing about her appearance suggested she belonged inside a room where billion-dollar contracts were negotiated. She looked like every other member of the hotel service staff. Ordinary, invisible, easily overlooked. Yet there was nothing uncertain about her expression. Ethan studied her carefully. She was not frightened. She was not seeking attention. If anything, she looked uncomfortable being noticed at all. That unsettled him more than the interruption itself. People who lied usually tried too hard to appear convincing. Claire seemed to wish she had never needed to speak. The foreign chairman quietly asked the interpreter a question in his native language. The interpreter answered without hesitation. Claire lowered her eyes for only a brief moment, listening. Then she slowly looked back at Ethan. "Sir," she said with respectful composure. "That is not what he asked." Another silence settled over the room, heavier than the first. Ethan felt something shift deep inside his instincts. The same instincts that had built his company from a modest regional business into one of the most influential corporations in America. He had learned long ago that numbers could be manipulated, presentations could be rehearsed, and confidence could be performed. Genuine conviction looked different. It often arrived quietly. He placed the pen on the table instead of the contract. Around him, no one moved. The deal could wait. The truth could not. Claire Harper immediately wished she had remained invisible. Every instinct told her to step back, apologize for interrupting, and return to pouring coffee as though nothing had happened. That would have been easier, safer, more appropriate for someone wearing a black waitress apron instead of a tailored business suit. Yet the sentence she had just heard continued echoing in her mind with impossible clarity. It was not merely translated incorrectly. Its meaning had been deliberately redirected. The difference sounded insignificant to anyone unfamiliar with the language, perhaps only a handful of carefully chosen words. But in international negotiations, a handful of words could quietly redefine obligations worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Claire had spent years studying exactly those differences before life unexpectedly carried her in another direction. Ethan Brooks rested both hands on the conference table, his attention fixed entirely on the young woman standing beside the coffee cart. She showed none of the nervous excitement he had often seen from people trying to impress powerful executives. She did not rush to explain herself. She did not raise her voice. She simply waited, almost hoping someone else would discover the mistake without requiring another word from her. Around the room, attorneys exchanged uncertain looks while financial advisors quietly reviewed the translated documents once again. The interpreter adjusted his tie before offering an easy smile. "Mr. Brooks," he said calmly, "I believe there has been an unfortunate misunderstanding." She probably overheard a phrase without understanding the full context. Claire lowered her eyes briefly before looking back toward Ethan. "That is possible," she answered with complete respect, "which is why I am only asking that you verify the conversation before signing." Her response surprised everyone. She had not accused anyone. She had not claimed certainty beyond question. She had simply requested caution. The restraint in her voice somehow made her words even more difficult to dismiss. Ethan noticed it immediately. Confident people often defended themselves aggressively. Truly knowledgeable people usually invited verification. One of the foreign delegates quietly spoke several additional sentences in his native language while looking directly at the interpreter. The interpreter translated almost instantly. Claire listened without moving. A faint crease appeared across her forehead. She waited until the translation ended before speaking again. "Sir," she said gently, addressing Ethan instead of the room. "He did not ask whether your company accepted the revised distribution schedule. He asked whether your company understood that exclusive regional authority would transfer after the first performance review." Silence settled across the conference room once more. This time it lasted longer. The chairman of the foreign delegation slowly turned toward the interpreter with visible confusion before repeating his original question. Several members of his own team exchanged puzzled expressions, sensing that something unexpected had happened. Ethan noticed the change immediately. For years, he had built his reputation by observing people during moments they could not rehearse. The foreign executives no longer looked comfortable. Neither did the interpreter. Claire, however, remained exactly the same. Calm, respectful, unassuming. She still held the polished silver coffee pot as though she expected someone to ask for another refill at any moment. Nothing about her posture suggested victory. She looked more concerned than relieved. Ethan finally pushed the unsigned contract several inches away from himself and folded his hands together. His voice remained composed, but every person in the room recognized the authority behind it. "Before anyone says another word," he said quietly, "I want every sentence translated again. Slowly, one line at a time. No assumptions. No summaries. Today we are not negotiating speed. We are negotiating truth." No one reached for the documents. No one glanced at a phone. Even the quiet hum of the air conditioning seemed louder than the people gathered around the conference table. Ethan Brooks looked first at the foreign chairman, then at the interpreter, and finally back to Claire Harper. Years of leading negotiations had taught him that tension rarely revealed the truth by itself. People did. He leaned back slightly in his chair, folded his hands, and spoke with the calm authority that had carried his company through countless international agreements. "We will proceed one sentence at a time," he said. "The original speaker will finish. The interpretation will follow. Then we will pause." No one objected. The chairman nodded politely before beginning again in his native language. His tone was measured, respectful, and deliberate. Every person in the room listened carefully, though only a handful understood the original words. When he finished, the interpreter translated confidently into English. Claire remained silent. She lowered her eyes toward the coffee service beside her, almost hoping she had misunderstood. Then the chairman added one more sentence, shorter this time, ending with a traditional expression rarely used outside formal diplomatic conversations. The interpreter smiled politely and rendered it as a simple, closing remark about future cooperation. Claire closed her eyes for the briefest moment. The expression had not referred to cooperation at all. It referred to stewardship, shared responsibility, and long-term mutual guardianship over regional operations. It carried legal and cultural implications that could influence every discussion that followed. She quietly placed the silver coffee pot onto the serving cart before speaking. "Sir," she said, looking only at Ethan, "may I explain one phrase?" Ethan answered immediately. "Please do." Claire stepped forward only a few inches, careful to remain respectful of the room. "The translation is grammatically correct," she began softly. "But the cultural meaning has changed." The chairman did not describe a partnership between equals. He described a temporary transfer of responsibility until one side demonstrates long-term trustworthiness. Those ideas sound similar in English, but they are treated very differently in his language. The chairman's eyes widened with unmistakable surprise. Before the interpreter could respond, the chairman himself addressed Claire directly in his own language. She answered with equal courtesy, matching the formal level of speech he had used. Their exchange lasted less than 30 seconds. Around the conference table, executives looked from one speaker to the other without understanding a word, yet everyone recognized something impossible to fake. The rhythm of the conversation felt natural. The pauses were effortless. The chairman smiled warmly before turning toward Ethan. This time he spoke slowly enough that even the interpreter hesitated. The chairman gently corrected the interpretation himself in careful English. "Miss Harper is correct," he said. "Those words carry responsibility beyond simple cooperation. We chose them very carefully." An uncomfortable silence settled over the room. The interpreter adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and quietly explained that certain cultural expressions were always difficult to translate literally. Claire did not challenge him. She simply listened. Ethan noticed that restraint once again. She never interrupted to win an argument. She spoke only when accuracy required it. That detail impressed him more than her remarkable command of the language itself. He looked around the conference room and saw experienced attorneys rereading their notes, financial advisors exchanging uncertain glances, and executives questioning assumptions they had accepted only minutes earlier. Then he looked back at Claire. She stood exactly where she had begun, wearing the same simple waitress apron, saying nothing more than necessary. For reasons he could not yet explain, Ethan trusted the quiet woman beside the coffee cart more than the expert seated beside the contract. Sometimes the loudest confidence filled a room. Sometimes the quietest honesty changed it. The revised translation continued at a slower pace. Each sentence examined with the care usually reserved for legal evidence rather than ordinary conversation. Ethan Brooks no longer focused only on the printed contract. Instead, he watched the faces around the table. The chairman from the foreign delegation spoke with calm confidence. Claire Harper listened quietly beside the coffee service without interrupting. The interpreter translated each statement with professional composure, yet something subtle had changed. Small pauses appeared where none had existed before. Certain phrases became noticeably shorter than the originals. Others arrived wrapped in explanations instead of direct meaning. To anyone unfamiliar with the language, the differences sounded insignificant. To Claire, they echoed like misplaced notes in a familiar piece of music. She had spent years learning that languages carried far more than vocabulary. They carried history, tradition, trust, and intention. Ethan noticed her thoughtful expression. She never reacted immediately. She always listened until an entire idea had been completed before deciding whether anything truly required correction. That patience impressed him. She was not searching for mistakes. She was protecting meaning. The chairman reached another section of the agreement and carefully described how both organizations would share responsibility for regional operations during the first 3 years of cooperation. The interpreter translated the statement into polished English, but Claire quietly lowered her eyes. Once again, an essential layer had disappeared. Ethan caught the movement immediately. "Miss Harper," he said gently, "did we lose something again?" Claire hesitated for only a moment. "Not a word, sir," she answered softly. "An intention." Every executive looked toward her. She continued with remarkable restraint. "The translation says both companies will cooperate equally from the beginning." The chairman actually described a relationship that grows into equality over time after both sides demonstrate reliability. That distinction changes expectations, not just grammar. The chairman nodded before Claire had even finished speaking. His expression reflected gratitude rather than surprise. He addressed Ethan directly in careful English. "She understands our business culture very well. Trust is earned before authority is shared. We believed your interpreter understood that difference." The interpreter immediately responded, explaining that literal wording often confused Western audiences and that he had simplified the language to keep negotiations moving efficiently. His explanation sounded reasonable. It also sounded rehearsed. Ethan remained silent, studying everyone around the table. He had built his career by recognizing when convenience quietly replaced accuracy. Simplicity often saved time, But in international business, it could also erase commitments that both sides believed they had made. Claire never challenged the interpreter personally. She simply reached toward one of the printed drafts lying unopened near the coffee service and respectfully asked permission to reference a single paragraph. Ethan nodded. Claire read the original wording aloud in the foreign language with flawless pronunciation before translating it into English sentence by sentence. She preserved every nuance without adding emotion or opinion. When she finished, the room felt different. The agreement no longer sounded like a routine commercial contract. It sounded like two organizations promising to protect one another's reputation while building confidence through shared responsibility. Several attorneys immediately began writing notes in the margins of their copies. One senior legal advisor quietly whispered that the revised interpretation aligned far more closely with the original legal framework. Ethan looked toward the chairman, who offered a warm smile of agreement. Then he looked at Claire. She had already stepped back beside the coffee cart, returning to the quiet role she believed belonged to her. She had no interest in becoming the center of the meeting. Yet without realizing it, the quiet waitress standing in a simple black apron had become the one person every experienced executive in the room was now listening to most carefully. The atmosphere inside the conference suite changed so gradually that no one noticed the exact moment confidence gave way to careful reflection. Attorneys who had entered expecting a routine signing ceremony were now comparing handwritten notes against the original language. Financial advisors quietly recalculated timelines after realizing that several obligations carried entirely different expectations when interpreted through the proper cultural context. Even the assistants who had been preparing folders for the ceremonial photographs paused their work, sensing that something far more important than a publicity event was unfolding before them. Ethan Brooks remained seated at the head of the table, saying very little. Throughout his career, he had learned that the best decisions were rarely made by the person who spoke the most. They belonged to the person willing to listen longer than everyone else. His eyes moved from the chairman to the interpreter, then to Claire Harper, who had quietly resumed pouring fresh coffee into delicate porcelain cups as though she had never interrupted the meeting at all. She served every guest with the same gentle professionalism, never lingering beside the executives who now watched her with unmistakable respect. One of the senior attorneys finally broke the silence. "Mr. Brooks," she said carefully, "if Miss Harper's interpretation reflects the intended legal meaning, we should revise several sections before any signatures are exchanged." Ethan nodded once. "Do it." The interpreter shifted in his chair before offering another explanation. He insisted that his translations followed accepted business practices and that simplifying certain expressions reduced unnecessary confusion between international partners. His reasoning sounded polished, but the chairman responded before Ethan could speak. Through careful English, he explained that his delegation had intentionally preserved traditional expressions because they represented the foundation of trust between their organization and future partners. Removing those expressions, even with good intentions, changed how commitment itself was understood. Claire listened quietly without interrupting either man. She recognized that this conversation no longer belonged to her. She had only hoped the truth would receive a fair hearing. While everyone discussed revisions, she noticed an elderly member of the foreign delegation struggling to read the updated draft without his glasses. Without drawing attention to herself, she walked over, adjusted the reading lamp beside him, and gently placed the correct page in front of him before returning to the coffee service. The elderly gentleman smiled with sincere gratitude and quietly thanked her in his own language. Claire answered with the same respectful formality he had used, causing him to smile even more warmly. Ethan observed the exchange from across the room. She had just helped preserve a billion-dollar negotiation, yet she treated that small act of kindness with exactly the same importance. The contrast stayed with him. Many people displayed excellence when everyone was watching. Claire displayed it even when no one seemed to notice. Nearly 40 minutes later, the attorneys completed a revised draft that reflected the original intentions expressed by the chairman. The foreign delegation reviewed every page together before nodding with visible satisfaction. Ethan accepted the updated document and read the final paragraphs himself. Although he did not understand every word of the original language, he understood something much more valuable now. Precision was not simply about vocabulary. It was about honoring another person's meaning instead of replacing it with convenient assumptions. He closed the folder slowly before looking toward Claire once more. She stood quietly beside the coffee cart, adjusting neatly folded linen napkins with the same calm focus she had shown all morning. To everyone else, she still looked like an ordinary waitress finishing her shift. To Ethan, she had become the quiet reason an entire partnership still deserved to exist. The revised agreement remained on the table, but no one reached for a pen. For the first time that morning, the conversation shifted away from numbers, delivery schedules, and legal clauses towards something far more difficult to measure: trust. Ethan Brooks looked around the conference room and realized that every person present had prepared extensively for financial negotiations, yet almost no one had prepared for the possibility that the greatest risk would come from misunderstanding another culture rather than misunderstanding a contract. The chairman quietly folded his reading glasses and offered Ethan a respectful smile. "Business begins with documents," he said in careful English. "Partnership begins with understanding." Ethan nodded slowly. Those words carried more weight now than they would have only an hour earlier. Claire Harper quietly replaced an empty coffee cup with a fresh one near the chairman before stepping back once again. She hoped the meeting had reached the point where she was no longer needed. The attorneys had corrected every important section. Both delegations appeared satisfied. She could finally return to the dining room, where another conference would soon begin. As she turned toward the service cart, Ethan spoke before she could leave. "Miss Harper." She stopped and faced him politely. "Yes, sir." Ethan stood from his chair, something that caused every executive in the room to instinctively do the same. He walked toward her without hurry, stopping a respectful distance away. "Before we continue," he said, "there is something I believe everyone in this room should know." Claire looked slightly uncomfortable as dozens of eyes settled on her once again. Ethan continued with calm sincerity. "This agreement exists today because someone with no obligation to interrupt chose honesty instead of convenience. She could have remained silent. She could have assumed the experts knew better. Instead, she protected people she had never met." The chairman immediately nodded in agreement. "Our delegation shares that opinion completely." Several executives quietly applauded. It was not loud. It was not ceremonial. It was the natural response of people who understood they had just witnessed quiet integrity. Claire lowered her eyes for a moment before speaking. "Thank you," she said softly. "But I only hoped everyone understood one another correctly." Ethan smiled gently. "That is precisely why this matters." One of the senior attorneys approached Claire holding the corrected contract. "Would you mind reviewing one final paragraph before we print the official version?" Claire hesitated. "If everyone agrees." The chairman answered first. "Please." She accepted the document, carefully read the final section, and suggested only one small adjustment to preserve the original tone of mutual respect. The attorneys immediately accepted the recommendation without debate. No one questioned her judgment anymore, not because she had demanded authority, but because she had earned trust. As the updated pages were sent for printing, the atmosphere inside the conference room felt completely different from the tense uncertainty that had filled it earlier. Conversations became warmer. Smiles appeared naturally. The chairman and Ethan spoke directly with one another instead of relying entirely on prepared scripts. Claire quietly gathered the empty coffee cups onto her serving tray, believing her role in the morning had finally ended. Yet as she reached the doorway, Ethan watched her leave with thoughtful eyes. He realized he knew almost nothing about the woman who had quietly changed the outcome of one of the most important negotiations of his career. She had never mentioned where she learned the language. She had never explained why someone with such remarkable knowledge wore a waitress apron instead of a business suit. She had offered the truth without asking for recognition, then returned to ordinary work as though extraordinary moments were simply another part of serving people well. Ethan had built an entire career by asking the right questions. As the conference room doors slowly closed behind Claire, he found himself asking the one question that suddenly mattered more than any billion-dollar agreement. Who was Claire Harper before the world stopped noticing her? The signing ceremony concluded just before noon. Photographers quietly captured the official handshake between Ethan Brooks and the chairman, while executives exchanged business cards beneath the bright conference room lights. The atmosphere felt lighter now, almost unrecognizable compared to the tense silence that had filled the room only hours earlier. Claire Harper was nowhere near the cameras. She had already returned to the hotel restaurant downstairs, replacing fresh linen napkins, polishing wine glasses, and preparing tables for the lunch crowd as though the morning had been entirely ordinary. She preferred it that way. Recognition faded quickly. Honest work remained. Nearly an hour later, Ethan entered the lobby without the delegation or his executive team. Daniel, his longtime assistant, walked beside him carrying a slim tablet. "I found what is publicly available," Daniel said quietly. "Nothing invasive. Just academic records and professional history." Ethan accepted the tablet as they waited for the elevator. The first page immediately challenged every assumption he had made. Claire Harper had graduated at the top of her university class in comparative linguistics. She had specialized in diplomatic translation, historical language systems, and cross-cultural negotiation. Several professors described her as one of the most gifted students they had taught in decades. There were published research papers, academic awards, and invitations to international conferences. Then, almost without explanation, the record stopped. No prestigious consulting firm. No university appointment. No government position. Instead, employment records showed restaurants, hotels, cafes, and hospitality work stretching back several years. Ethan slowly read every page twice. One brief public announcement finally explained what the resume never did. Claire had withdrawn from a fully funded doctoral fellowship shortly after her widowed mother developed a long-term medical condition that required daily care. There were no interviews, no articles celebrating sacrifice, no dramatic headlines. She had simply disappeared from academic life and quietly found work that allowed flexible hours close to home. Ethan lowered the tablet and stared through the hotel windows toward the busy Manhattan streets. Her words from earlier returned with unexpected clarity. She had never spoken about sacrifice. She had never mentioned personal hardship. She had only insisted that meaning should never be replaced by convenience. Now he understood why. She had lived that belief for years. Daniel broke the silence carefully. "Would you like me to contact her?" Ethan shook his head almost immediately. "No." Daniel looked surprised. Ethan smiled faintly. "Not yet. She has spent enough of her life having circumstances choose for her. If I speak with her again, it will be because she has the freedom to decide, not because I interrupted another day of honest work." Downstairs, Claire greeted a family visiting from Ohio, helped an elderly couple find a quieter table near the windows, and patiently explained the lunch specials to a businessman rushing between meetings. No one recognized her from the conference upstairs. No one knew she had quietly protected a partnership worth more than most people could imagine. She carried plates with the same steady hands that had preserved the meaning of an international agreement only hours earlier. Ethan watched from the upper balcony for a brief moment before turning away. He realized that the rarest quality he had encountered was not extraordinary intelligence. It was extraordinary humility. The world had overlooked Claire Harper because she never asked to be seen. Yet somehow, by choosing service over recognition and truth over applause, she had become the one person he could no longer overlook. The following Monday morning, sunlight poured through the towering glass walls of Brooks International headquarters, casting long reflections across the polished stone floor of the executive lobby. Employees moved with quiet purpose, preparing for the company's weekly leadership meeting. The successful partnership signed only days earlier had already become headline news throughout the business world, praised as one of the year's most promising international agreements. Few people knew how close it had come to collapsing because of a handful of misunderstood words. Fewer still knew that the person responsible for preserving it had returned to serving coffee before the ink on the contract had fully dried. Ethan Brooks stood alone in his office overlooking Manhattan, rereading one particular page from the revised agreement. The legal language was precise. The cultural meaning remained intact. Every sentence reflected mutual respect instead of hidden imbalance. He smiled faintly, remembering how confidently he had trusted expertise without ever questioning whether understanding and credentials were truly the same thing. A soft knock interrupted his thoughts. Daniel entered carrying a slim folder. "The chairman called this morning," he said. He wanted to express his appreciation once again. He also asked whether Miss Harper would be attending future negotiations. Ethan looked up. "What did you tell him?" Daniel answered honestly, "That she does not work for us." Ethan remained silent for several seconds before quietly replying, Not working for us does not mean she should never be invited when her knowledge can help people understand one another. That afternoon, Ethan returned to the hotel without announcing his visit in advance. The lunch rush had just ended. Claire Harper stood behind the service station, carefully organizing polished silverware into neatly arranged trays. She looked up as the restaurant manager approached, explaining that a guest wished to speak with her. When she saw Ethan waiting near the entrance, genuine surprise crossed her face. "Good afternoon, Mr. Brooks," she said warmly. "I hope everything went well after the meeting." Ethan smiled. "It went better because of you." Claire lowered her eyes modestly. "I am glad everyone reached an understanding." Ethan gently placed a small envelope on the reception counter. "This belongs to you." Claire opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten letter signed by every member of the foreign delegation, thanking her for protecting not only the agreement, but also the dignity of their language and traditions. Beneath the letter rested an invitation to attend future cultural consultations whenever she wished, with complete freedom to accept or decline. There was no contract attached, no salary proposal, no pressure, only gratitude. Claire read the letter slowly before looking back at Ethan. "You did not have to do this." Ethan shook his head. "Actually, I did. Recognition should not depend on job titles." Claire smiled with quiet appreciation. "Thank you." Ethan hesitated before continuing. "There is something else. Brooks International is creating an independent cultural advisory council for our international partnerships. I would like to offer you a seat whenever you decide the time is right. You would choose your own schedule. Your family comes first. That will never be questioned." Claire's expression softened. She realized he had taken the time to understand her circumstances without trying to change them. "I cannot promise today," she answered honestly. "Then do not," Ethan replied with a gentle smile. "Some opportunities should wait until the person is ready, not the other way around." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The afternoon sunlight reflected across the restaurant windows while guests quietly enjoyed late lunches nearby. Nothing about the scene appeared extraordinary to anyone passing outside. Yet within that simple conversation, respect had quietly replaced assumption, understanding had replaced pride, and two completely different lives had found common ground through the rare language that needed no translation at all. 3 months later, the partnership that nearly failed because of a single mistranslated sentence had become one of the strongest international alliances Brooks International had ever built. Industry analysts praised its stability. Business journals highlighted its unusual level of cooperation. Competitors tried to understand why negotiations that many expected to become difficult had instead grown stronger with time. Inside the company, only a small circle of people knew the real answer. They remembered a quiet waitress who had chosen truth over silence when remaining silent would have been far easier. Claire Harper never spoke publicly about that morning. She continued working at the hotel several days each week while caring for her mother, and on the days she was available, she accepted invitations to serve as an independent cultural advisor during selected international meetings. She never asked for a corner office. She never requested a prestigious title. She simply reviewed conversations, explained cultural context, and reminded experienced executives that understanding another person always required more than translating individual words. Her calm presence gradually became something many visiting partners quietly appreciated before negotiations even began. Ethan Brooks noticed another unexpected change as well. Meetings became slower, but disagreements became fewer. Executives listened more carefully before responding. Interpreters were encouraged to explain cultural meaning instead of rushing through literal translations. New employees received training that emphasized respect for language, tradition, and perspective alongside legal accuracy and financial planning. What had begun as one woman's quiet warning slowly transformed the way an entire company communicated with the world. One afternoon, after another successful international meeting, Ethan found Claire standing near the hotel windows waiting for a taxi after finishing her shift. The city glowed beneath the warm colors of the setting sun, and people hurried along the sidewalks without realizing how many remarkable stories quietly unfolded around them every day. Ethan walked over carrying 2 paper cups of coffee. He handed one to Claire with an appreciative smile. "I realized something," he said. Claire looked at him with gentle curiosity. "What is that?" Ethan watched the traffic move through the streets below before answering. "When we first met, I believed intelligence announced itself with impressive resumes, expensive offices, and confident voices. I was wrong. Claire smiled softly, but said nothing. Ethan continued. The smartest person in the room was the only one who never tried to convince anyone she was. Claire looked down at the warm coffee cup resting between her hands. Knowledge can open a conversation, she said quietly. Character decides whether people keep listening. Ethan nodded slowly. He knew he would remember those words for the rest of his life. A taxi pulled to the curb outside the hotel. Claire thanked him for the coffee, adjusted the strap of her simple work bag, and prepared to leave. Before opening the door, she turned back with the same calm smile she had worn on the day everything changed. Thank you, she said. Not for the opportunity. For listening. Ethan watched the taxi disappear into the evening traffic until its taillights blended with the countless lights of Manhattan. Only then did he understand that the greatest investment he had ever made was not measured in dollars, contracts, or market value. It had begun the moment he chose to pause, to question what seemed certain, and to listen to a quiet voice everyone else had almost ignored. Sometimes the most valuable translation is not between two languages. Sometimes it is the journey from pride to respect. And sometimes the most extraordinary people never ask the world to notice them at all. They simply choose to do the right thing, one quiet moment at a time.